It was supposed to be a regular day for Marion James, the city's first black female mayor, until a phone call turned her life upside down. Her 16-year-old daughter, Amanda, was arrested for a crime she didn't commit. What follows is a relentless battle against a broken system, racial bias, and a political crisis that threatens to destroy Marion's career. But what happens when justice is finally served? You won't believe the shocking twists in this true fight for fairness. Watch until the end, and I guarantee you'll be left speechless. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more powerful stories, and let me know in the comments, what would you do if this happened to your family? It had been a typical day for Marion James, the mayor of one of the largest cities in the state. As the first black woman to hold such a position, she had grown accustomed to the challenges that came with her role, balancing politics, addressing social issues, and constantly being in the public eye. But nothing in her political career had prepared her for the phone call she was about to receive. The ringing of her phone cut through the silence of her office, dragging her out of her thoughts. It was almost evening, and she had just finished another grueling meeting on urban development. Marion expected it to be a staff member, a last-minute question, or maybe a reminder about an upcoming event. Instead, it was the police. Mayor James, this is Officer Coleman with the precinct downtown. I'm calling to inform you that your daughter, Amanda James, has been arrested for shoplifting. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Marion froze in her chair, gripping her phone tightly. Amanda? Arrested? It didn't make any sense. Her daughter was a good kid, smart, responsible, focused on her studies. Shoplifting was the last thing Amanda would ever do. You must be mistaken, Marion said, trying to keep her voice steady. Amanda would never. The evidence is clear, ma'am. She was caught leaving a store with expensive jewelry in her bag. We'll need you to come down to the station, the officer replied, his tone formal but detached. Marion's mind raced. She couldn't understand how this had happened, but there was no time to think. She had to get to her daughter. She grabbed her keys and rushed out of her office, heart pounding, her thoughts jumbled with fear, confusion, and disbelief. The drive to the police station felt like an eternity. Marion's hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated through the city streets. Flashing memories of her daughter's smile, her laughter, her confidence. None of it matched the image of a girl who would steal. When she finally arrived at the station, she stormed inside, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She had faced political adversaries, handled citywide crises, but this was personal. At the front desk, she was greeted by a young officer who looked uncomfortable the moment he recognized her. Mayor James, he stammered, please follow me. Without waiting for his guidance, Marion walked past him, her mind fixed on seeing Amanda. They led her to the back of the station, where Amanda was sitting in a holding cell, looking small and terrified. Her daughter's wide, tear-filled eyes met hers, and Marion's heart broke. "Mama," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't do it. I swear, I didn't do it." Marion wanted nothing more than to wrap her arms around her daughter. But the cold, hard bars of the cell stood between them. The helplessness weighed on her like a lead blanket. She turned to the officer who had brought her there. "Where's the evidence?" Marion demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "I want to see the proof." The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the mayor's directness, but eventually led her to a room where they reviewed the surveillance footage from the store. Marion watched, her eyes narrowing as the grainy video played out. There was Amanda, walking through the store, browsing the shelves like any other customer. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until she approached the jewelry section. That's when the video seemed to take a strange turn. Another customer, a middle-aged woman, bumped into Amanda. And a few moments later, security stopped her at the exit. Jewelry had been found in Amanda's bag. "This doesn't prove anything," Marion snapped. "It shows she was bumped by someone else. She didn't steal that jewelry." "The store's management insists it was her," the officer replied, and the security guard testified that she was the only one in the area when the jewelry went missing. Marion clenched her fists. This was absurd. Her daughter was being framed, and she knew it. But how could she prove it? How could she fight back against a system that had already decided Amanda was guilty? "You have to let her go," Marion demanded. "She's innocent." The officer looked down, avoiding her gaze. "I'm sorry, Mayor James. She'll have to stay in custody for now. The charges will be filed tomorrow." Marion's blood boiled. This was her daughter they were talking about, her child. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let Amanda suffer for something she didn't do. She stormed back to Amanda's cell, her voice cracking with emotion. "Don't worry, baby. I'm going to get you out of here, I promise." Amanda nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't do it, Mama," she whispered again. "I know," Marion said, her voice firm but trembling. "I know you didn't." But as she left the station that night, Marion knew that this was only the beginning. She could feel the weight of the system pressing down on her, the same system she had fought to reform as mayor. Now, she was caught in its clutches, fighting not just as a leader but as a mother. The thought terrified her. Driving home, her mind raced with questions. Why hadn't the police believed Amanda? Why were they so quick to assume her guilt? Was it because of who she was? Because of the color of her skin? The city lights blurred through the windshield as Marion's frustration grew. She had always known there were deep, systemic problems within the police force. Racial bias, inequality, unjust treatment. These were issues she had fought against her entire career. But now, it wasn't just a political issue. It was personal. The next morning, Marion was back at the station, armed with her legal team. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. The fight for Amanda's freedom had begun. But as she soon discovered, the fight was much bigger than she had anticipated. This wasn't just about clearing her daughter's name. It was about confronting a broken system. A system that was determined to punish Amanda despite the evidence, despite the truth. And Marion James, the mayor who had spent years fighting for her city, was about to take on the fight of her life. This time, the stakes were higher than ever. The next morning, Marion stood outside the police station, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on her. She hadn't slept. How could she? Every second that Amanda remained in that cold, sterile cell gnawed at her. Marion had spent the night consulting with her legal team, formulating a plan to secure Amanda's release. But now, standing on the threshold of the police station again, she couldn't shake the sense that this fight would be much harder than she had anticipated. As she stepped inside, her attorney, David Reynolds, joined her. He was a seasoned professional, known for handling high-profile cases with precision and calm. But even he seemed uneasy about what lay ahead. "They won't make this easy for us," he warned as they walked toward the front desk. "The fact that they haven't released her despite the evidence. Something's off here." Marion clenched her jaw. She already knew something was off. Amanda's innocence was clear, yet the police were treating her like a criminal. Marion couldn't help but wonder if the color of her daughter's skin had something to do with it. They were led into a small conference room where the officer from the night before, Officer Coleman, was waiting. His expression was as cold and unreadable as ever. Marion felt her temper flare, but she kept it in check. "We've reviewed the evidence," Marion began, her voice steady but sharp. "The surveillance footage clearly shows that Amanda was bumped by another customer. She didn't steal anything." Officer Coleman barely blinked. "The store management disagrees. The jewelry was found in her possession, and until we have a clearer picture, she will remain in custody." "That's absurd," David interjected, his voice firm. "There's no basis for holding her. The video contradicts the accusation. You can't hold a minor without substantial proof." Coleman shifted uncomfortably, but remained steadfast. "We're just following procedure. The charges will be filed soon, and the case will go to court." Marion's patience snapped. "You're holding my daughter on nothing but assumptions. This is not just following procedure. This is an injustice, and you know it." Her words echoed in the room, and for a brief moment she saw a flicker of doubt in Coleman's eyes. But it was quickly replaced by the same blank professionalism. "Mayor James," he said, lowering his voice, "I understand your concern, but we have to let the system play out." Marion felt the familiar frustration boiling inside her. "The system," she repeated bitterly, the same system that had failed so many before, especially those who looked like her daughter. David placed a hand on Marion's arm, gently signaling her to take a breath. "We'll pursue this through the courts if necessary," he said calmly, "but I'll be filing a formal complaint about the unlawful detainment of Amanda James." Officer Coleman nodded stiffly. "That's your right." Marion stormed out of the room, her heart pounding. She had spent her career trying to reform the very system that was now holding her daughter hostage. It was a system she knew was broken, built on biases and outdated procedures that too often punished the innocent. And now Amanda was caught in its web. Outside, the air felt heavy and oppressive. Marion took a deep breath, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. How had it come to this? How had her daughter become another statistic in a system she had fought so hard to change? David stood beside her, flipping through his notes. "We'll have to take this to court," he said, his tone practical. "I'll file an injunction to get her released, but it might take some time." "Time we don't have," Marion replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Every minute Amanda spends in there, it's breaking her." David didn't argue. He understood the urgency. But the law moved slowly, and Marion knew it. She had seen it time and time again, justice delayed, lives destroyed by bureaucracy. As they walked toward the parking lot, Marion's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from her chief of staff. "The media has picked up the story. Headlines are already circulating. Be prepared for questions." Marion groaned inwardly. This was the last thing she needed. The public eye was about to turn on her, and she knew the narrative would be twisted. Her opponents would seize on this, turn it into a scandal, a weakness in her leadership. "Have you seen the news?" David asked, noticing her expression. "Yes," Marion muttered. "It's already starting." "They'll try to make this political," he said grimly. "But we need to keep the focus on Amanda's innocence. Don't let them turn this into a referendum on your leadership." Marion nodded, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Politics was dirty, and her enemies would use anything they could to undermine her. Her daughter's arrest would be spun into a story about a mayor who couldn't even control her own family, let alone an entire city. By the time Marion got home, her phone was buzzing non-stop with calls from reporters. political allies, and even a few enemies. She ignored them all, sinking into a chair and burying her face in her hands. For the first time in her life, she felt powerless. The headlines that flashed across her mind weren't just about her daughter. They were about every black child, every family that had been torn apart by a system that didn't care. She thought of all the parents who had fought for their children, only to be met with the same indifference, the same stonewalling. But Marion wasn't just any parent. She was the mayor. She had power, influence, and a platform, and if they thought she would sit back and let this happen, they were sorely mistaken. By the next morning, Marion was ready to fight. She had rallied her legal team, prepared statements for the press, and reached out to community leaders. She wasn't going to let them paint her daughter as a criminal, and she wasn't going to let the system crush Amanda like it had crushed so many others. At a press conference held later that day, Marion stood before the cameras, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced difficult moments in her career before, but none like this. She looked out at the sea of reporters, their pens poised, their eyes sharp, ready for any misstep. Clearing her throat, Marion began to speak. Yesterday, my daughter, Amanda James, was arrested for a crime she did not commit. The evidence proving her innocence is clear, and yet she remains in custody. This is not just an issue of one young woman's life being put on hold. It is a reflection of the deeper flaws within our justice system. She paused, letting her words sink in. As mayor of this city, I have worked tirelessly to address these issues, but today I stand here not only as a leader but as a mother, and I will not rest until my daughter is home, and until justice is served for her and for every other child who has been wrongfully accused and detained. The cameras flashed, and questions were hurled at her from all sides, but Marion felt a sense of resolve building inside her. The system might be broken, but she was going to do everything in her power to fix it. This fight wasn't just about Amanda anymore. It was about a city, a community, and a system that needed to be held accountable. And Marion James wasn't backing down. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of Marion's press conference, the story had become the talk of the city. It wasn't just local headlines anymore. It was national. The arrest of the mayor's daughter, Amanda James, a bright 16-year-old falsely accused of theft, struck a chord with people across the country. Social media erupted with hashtags like #FreeAmanda and #JusticeForAmanda, while television pundits debated the implications of the case. Marion watched it all unfold from her office window, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages of support and concern. But there was no comfort in it. She wasn't interested in the media circus. All she cared about was getting Amanda out of that cell and back home, where she belonged. Yet every day that passed seemed to bring more delays, more excuses from the police, and more frustration. By the end of the week, the city was in turmoil. Protests began to spring up in front of the police station where Amanda was being held. At first, they were small, just a few dozen people, holding signs and chanting for her release, but soon the numbers grew. Entire streets were filled with protesters, waving signs that read "Justice for Amanda" and "Stop criminalizing our kids." Marion drove past one of the larger protests on her way to the police station, her heart heavy with both pride and sadness. The people were angry, and rightly so. Amanda's case was not an isolated incident. It was the latest in a long line of injustices. The racial bias that had put her daughter behind bars had been a part of the system for decades, and now the city was waking up to it in a way Marion had never seen before. As she approached the station, the noise of the crowd outside grew louder. Chants echoed in the air, and the police had set up barricades to keep the protesters at bay. Marion parked her car and stepped out, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The officers moved with a nervous energy, clearly aware of the growing unrest outside. Marion walked to the front desk, where Officer Coleman was waiting, looking even more uncomfortable than the last time she had seen him. "Mayor James," he greeted her stiffly. "The chief is expecting you." Marion followed him down a narrow hallway, her mind racing. She knew this meeting was going to be a battle, another attempt by the police to cover up their mistake, to protect their own, instead of admitting they had wrongfully imprisoned an innocent girl. But Marion wasn't backing down, not now. In the chief's office, Chief Watson stood by the window, staring out at the growing crowd. He was an imposing figure, a man who had spent decades in law enforcement and knew how to navigate the political landscape of the city. But today, his normally calm demeanor was cracking. Marion could see the strain in his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, just as it was on her. "Mayor," he said, turning to face her as she entered. "We need to talk." "We do," Marion replied, her voice firm. "We need to talk about why my daughter is still in a cell when the evidence clearly shows she's innocent." Chief Watson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I understand your frustration, but this case has become complicated." "Complicated?" Marion repeated, her anger flaring. "There's nothing complicated about it. The video shows Amanda didn't steal anything. This is about her being a black girl in a store full of expensive jewelry. It's about assumptions, Chief. And you know it." Watson's eyes narrowed slightly. "This isn't about race, Mayor. It's about procedure. The store's management is pressing charges, and we have to follow the legal process." Marion stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You and I both know that if Amanda were white, this wouldn't have gone this far. She would have been home with her family by now." Watson didn't respond immediately. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing back out the window at the protesters. "The public is upset. We're doing everything we can to move this case forward, but we have to follow the law." "The law?" Marion's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. "The law is supposed to protect the innocent, not imprison them based on racial bias. You're letting a 16-year-old girl sit in jail for a crime she didn't commit because you're afraid of admitting your department made a mistake." For a moment, silence hung in the air between them. Watson looked away, his jaw tight. "I'm doing my job, Mayor, and I suggest you let me do it," he said quietly. Marion's eyes flashed with anger, but she held her ground. "And I'm doing mine. I won't stop until Amanda is free, and until the people responsible for this injustice are held accountable. I've fought for this city for years, Chief, and I'm not going to stand by and watch it tear my family apart." She turned on her heel and left the office, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she walked back out into the lobby, the noise from the crowd outside had grown louder, more insistent. Marion paused at the front door, looking out at the sea of people who had gathered in Amanda's name. They were holding signs, chanting her daughter's name, demanding justice. Marion stepped out into the sunlight, and the crowd roared at the sight of her. She could feel the energy, the frustration, the pain of a community that had been ignored for too long. It wasn't just about Amanda anymore. It was about all the black boys and girls, all the families that had been broken by a system that saw them as less than human. One of the protesters, a woman in her 20s, approached Marion, her eyes burning with anger and determination. "We're with you, Mayor," she said, her voice fierce. "We're not going to stop until Amanda is home." Marion nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for standing with us." The woman turned back to the crowd, raising her fist in the air. "Justice for Amanda!" she shouted, and the crowd erupted into chants. Marion stood there for a moment, watching the people who had come together in her daughter's name. She felt a surge of strength, of resolve. This wasn't just a fight for Amanda anymore. It was a fight for all of them, and Marion was going to see it through, no matter what. That night, the protests continued to grow. News outlets broadcasted the scenes live, showing thousands of people marching through the streets, demanding justice. The city was on the verge of something huge, something that could either tear it apart or bring it together in a way Marion had never imagined. Back at home, Marion sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone as messages from political allies and community leaders poured in. Some offered support, while others warned her about the dangers of escalating the situation. But Marion knew there was no turning back now. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She stood up, her heart racing, and opened it to find David, her attorney, standing there, a grim look on his face. "They've officially filed the charges," he said quietly. "Amanda's case is going to court." Marion felt her knees buckle slightly. Despite everything she had done, despite the protests, the evidence, the public outcry, the system was moving forward with the charges. "We're going to fight this," David continued. "But we need to prepare for a long battle. This isn't going to be easy." Marion nodded, her throat tight. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was entirely true. As David left, Marion sat down again, her mind racing. She had always known this fight would be difficult. But now, staring down the reality of a court battle, it felt overwhelming. The weight of the city, the protests, the media, it was all crashing down on her. But then she thought of Amanda, alone in that cell, scared and confused, and Marion's resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had been wronged, for all the families who had been torn apart by injustice. And she wasn't going to stop until Amanda was free. As the days passed, the city continued to simmer with tension. What had begun as protests for Amanda's release was now turning into a full-blown political crisis. The streets were alive with outrage, and every night the crowds grew larger. What was once a peaceful demonstration had now become a standoff with the police. Clashes erupted, tear gas filled the air, and the city began to unravel under the weight of its own unrest. Marion sat in her office, watching the news on a small television mounted on the wall. Footage of the protests played on a loop, crowds chanting, police standing in lines with shields, skirmishes breaking out in pockets across the city. It was chaos. Every screen, every headline seemed to scream the same thing: justice for Amanda. But now, it wasn't just about her daughter. It had spiraled into something far bigger. The frustration that had long been simmering beneath the surface of the city's fabric had finally erupted, and Amanda's case was just the spark that ignited it. "Mayor, the governor's office is on the line again," her chief of staff said, breaking through her thoughts. His voice was tense, as if he knew this call wasn't going to bring good news. Marion sighed, rubbing her temples. The governor had been pressuring her to bring the situation under control for days now. But what did they expect her to do? She was fighting a system that had turned against her and her family. The people in the streets were fighting for justice, justice that had been denied to them for so long. To simply quiet them down, to ask them to stop, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. But Marion knew she couldn't ignore the governor's call. She picked up the phone. "Governor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "Mayor James?" The governor's voice crackled over the line. "This situation is getting out of hand. I've got calls coming in from businesses, from other city officials, hell, even from federal authorities. We need to get a handle on this now, or it's going to turn into a full-blown disaster." Marion closed her eyes for a moment. "I understand the concern, Governor, but this is more than just a protest. The people are demanding justice, and until that happens, the unrest will continue. Amanda's case is symptomatic of a much larger problem." "Look, I get that," the governor replied, his tone sharp. "But right now, you have a city on the brink of chaos. The media is running with this 24/7, and we're looking at a complete breakdown in law and order. You need to restore control. Bring in the National Guard if you have to, but this can't go on." The suggestion of using the National Guard hit Marion like a punch to the gut. The thought of armed soldiers on the streets of her city, facing down the very people she had spent her career fighting for, was unbearable. "I can't do that," Marion said quietly, but firmly. "These are peaceful protesters, people who have been ignored for too long. They're not the enemy. We can't meet their cries for justice with force." "Then find another way, Marion. But this can't last much longer. The city is on the verge of collapse, and if it does, your career is going down with it." The call ended abruptly, leaving Marion staring at the phone, her mind racing. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Her political opponents were circling like vultures, ready to pounce on any misstep she made. In the media, they were already spinning the narrative. Mayor Marion James, unable to control her city, her own daughter, at the center of the storm. She could see the headlines now, see the way they would use this crisis to tear her down. But Marion wasn't about to let them. She hadn't fought her way to the top of the political ladder just to be knocked down by a system that thrived on keeping people like her in their place. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. David, her attorney, entered, his face lined with exhaustion. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low. "They've assigned one of the toughest prosecutors in the city to Amanda's case. He's determined to push this to trial, despite the evidence in her favor." Marion's heart sank. "A trial? This is ridiculous. We have the surveillance footage, we have witnesses. Amanda is innocent." David nodded, sitting down across from her. "I know. But this prosecutor has an agenda. He wants to make an example out of her, to show that no one is above the law, even if they're the daughter of the mayor." Marion clenched her fists, anger flaring inside her. It was all political. They were using her daughter to send a message, to undermine her credibility as a leader. Amanda wasn't just a young girl caught in a nightmare. She was a pawn in a game far bigger than either of them. "What can we do?" Marion asked, her voice tight with frustration. David sighed. "We fight. We take this to court. We present our evidence and we make it clear that Amanda is being wrongfully accused. But you need to be prepared for a long, drawn-out battle. This prosecutor is going to make it as difficult as possible." Marion felt a surge of helplessness. The thought of her daughter being dragged through a public trial, of her name and reputation being torn apart by the media, was unbearable. But what choice did they have? The system had failed Amanda, just as it had failed so many others. Now the only way to clear her name was to fight it head-on. As the day wore on, the protests outside City Hall intensified. Marion watched from her window as the streets filled with people, young and old, black and white, all united in their demand for justice. The air was thick with tension, but also with hope. The city was changing. Marion could feel it, even through the chaos. By the time the sun began to set, Marion knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit in her office while her city was on the brink of collapse. She needed to address the people, to stand with them, to show them that she was still fighting for what was right. She stepped out of her office and made her way to the balcony that overlooked the square in front of City Hall. As soon as she appeared, the crowd roared, their voices rising in a deafening wave of support. Marion stood at the edge of the balcony, her heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. But she felt a surge of strength as she looked out over the sea of faces. This was her city. These were her people, and they were counting on her to lead them through this. She took a deep breath and raised her hand, signaling for silence. Slowly the crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. "My daughter, Amanda James, is innocent," Marion began, her voice steady and clear. "The evidence proves it, and yet she remains behind bars. This is not just a case of one girl being wrongfully accused. This is about a system that is broken, a system that targets our children, that criminalizes them for the color of their skin, that denies them justice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their energy palpable. "But I want you to know," Marion continued, "that I will not stop fighting for my daughter. I will not stop fighting for justice, not just for Amanda, but for every single person in this city who has been wronged by a system that sees them as less than. This is our city, and we will not let it be torn apart by injustice." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices filling the air like a wave of defiance. Marion stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the fight of her life, and she wasn't going to back down. As the crowd continued to chant her name, Marion knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The system was powerful, and her opponents would do everything in their power to crush her. But she wasn't fighting alone. The people were with her, and together they were going to bring about the change the city so desperately needed. No matter what it took, Marion James was going to see this fight through to the end. The city was in crisis, but from that crisis, a new era was beginning to take shape, an era where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality, and Marion would make sure of it. The courtroom was silent, a heavy stillness lingering in the air as Marion sat beside David, waiting for the judge to enter. It had taken months of preparation, countless sleepless nights, and endless legal battles. But they were finally here, the trial that would determine Amanda's fate. The city outside was tense, divided, yet hopeful. Protests still flared, the media was relentless, and Marion's political career hung in the balance. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was Amanda. Her daughter sat a few seats away, her face pale but composed. She had grown so much since the day of her arrest. The fear and confusion had given way to quiet strength, and Marion couldn't help but feel proud of her. Amanda had withstood the weight of injustice with grace, but Marion knew how much this had cost her. Every moment spent in custody had been a moment of her innocence, eroded by a system that had failed her. The sound of the door opening pulled Marion from her thoughts. The judge entered, his black robe flowing as he took his seat. The prosecutor, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was well known, stood tall, glancing at Marion and Amanda with a confidence that made Marion's stomach churn. He had been relentless throughout the case, determined to see Amanda punished despite the overwhelming evidence of her innocence. But today, Marion had hope. They had the truth on their side. They had the footage, the witnesses, and the support of a city that had rallied behind Amanda's case. Today was the day they would finally prove Amanda's innocence, and Marion could feel the weight of that hope pressing down on her. David leaned over, whispering, "We've got this. Just stay calm." Marion nodded, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She watched as the prosecutor stood to give his opening statement, painting Amanda as a criminal, twisting the narrative to make it seem like her actions had been premeditated. It was infuriating, but Marion kept her composure, knowing that their turn would come. Finally, it was David's time to speak. He rose from his chair, his voice steady and confident as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is not a case of guilt, but of mistaken identity and a rush to judgment. Amanda James is innocent. The evidence will show that she did not steal anything, that she was wrongfully accused based on assumptions rather than facts. We will present clear, undeniable proof that Amanda was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." As David spoke, Marion could see the jury begin to shift in their seats, some of them nodding in agreement. The courtroom was tense, but there was a palpable shift in the energy. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Marion felt like they had a real chance. The next few days were a blur of testimonies, cross-examinations, and arguments. The surveillance footage played multiple times, showing Amanda browsing the store, being bumped by the real culprit, and then being wrongfully detained. Witnesses, including store employees and customers, testified in her favor. Marion watched as the prosecutor's case began to unravel, his confident demeanor slipping as the truth came to light. But the turning point came when the real culprit, the woman who had bumped into Amanda, was called to testify. She had been identified after a lengthy investigation, and though reluctant, she eventually confessed to her role in the incident. The courtroom was stunned into silence as she admitted to slipping the jewelry into Amanda's bag in an attempt to cover her own tracks. Marion's heart soared. This was it. The truth was finally out. Amanda was innocent, and now the world knew it. As the trial drew to a close, David gave his final statement, urging the jury to see the case for what it was, an injustice that had wrongfully imprisoned an innocent young girl. Marion watched the jury closely as they filed out of the room to deliberate. The waiting was excruciating. Every second felt like an eternity. Hours later, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into an anxious silence as the verdict was read. On the charge of theft, we find the defendant, Amanda James, not guilty. The words echoed in Marion's mind, filling her with a rush of relief so powerful it almost brought her to tears. Amanda was free. Her daughter was free. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Marion didn't hear any of it. She turned to Amanda, who sat frozen in her seat, as if the weight of the verdict hadn't fully sunk in. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Amanda's face, and Marion rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I told you we'd get through this," Marion whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're free, Amanda. It's over." Amanda held her mother tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Mama. I couldn't have done this without you." But Marion knew the truth. It wasn't just her fight. It was Amanda's strength, her resilience that had carried them through. And it wasn't just a victory for their family. It was a victory for the entire city, for everyone who had stood up against injustice. As they walked out of the courthouse, they were met with the cheers of supporters, protesters, and allies who had followed the case from the beginning. The crowd had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for Amanda, and we won't be silenced." Marion looked out over the crowd, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still so many others who were trapped in the same system that had tried to destroy Amanda. But today, they had won a battle, and that victory would inspire countless others to keep fighting. Amanda stood beside her, waving to the crowd, her face lit up with joy and relief. For the first time in months, Marion felt a sense of peace. They had fought the system, and they had won. And now, they could begin to heal. That night, as Marion sat at home with Amanda, surrounded by friends and family, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them to this moment. The protests, the media frenzy, the political battles. It had all been worth it, not just for Amanda, but for the future of their city. Marion knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more challenges, more fights for justice. But now, the city had changed. The people had changed, and so had she. Amanda's case had been a catalyst for something greater, a movement that demanded accountability, fairness, and equality for all. Marion was determined to keep pushing forward, to continue the work she had started. She would not allow the system to crush anyone else the way it had tried to crush her daughter. As the city slowly began to heal from the crisis, Marion knew that this was just the beginning. Amanda's freedom had been a hard-won victory, but the fight for justice was far from over. And Marion was ready to lead, ready to fight, and ready to ensure that what happened to Amanda would never happen to anyone else in her city. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was filled with hope. And Marion James knew that together they could build a city where justice was no longer an aspiration, but a reality for all. Thank you for watching till the end. If this story moved you, make sure to hit the subscribe button. It's just one click for you. But it means the world to me and helps create even more powerful content. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. How would you fight for justice in a situation like this? And don't stop here. Check out my other videos for more inspiring stories. Stay tuned, stay informed, and let's keep the conversation going.